So first of all, I just want to say hello to everybody, but I don't want to. If I spend all the time to chat, we're never going to get around to the program we're here for tonight. As much as I would like to catch up with all of you, so and this it does take me a good hour to get through the stuff that I'm hoping to get through today. In fact, it's a challenge for me to get through everything that I'd like to share in the short amount of time we have. Aha, there's Anne. So. So I'm going to get started here in a minute. First of all, it's great to see you. As a logistical thing, not at exactly this moment, but very shortly. In fact, you know what you all can do right away is you can all please turn off your microphones. That should be an option that you see there. And if you can't figure out how to do that, then I don't know what to tell you. But if you can turn off the microphones, that doesn't mean you have to keep them off permanently for the whole length of this. From time to time, I will probably be asking questions and inviting participation. So, and at the moment that you have something that you want or need to say, then you certainly can and should turn on your microphone. But in the meantime, it helps keep things a little bit more organized. Heather and I were talking beforehand that we're going to try to let people keep their video on. If it starts to slow things down because of the internet, then we might have to go to where I'm the only one on video. But let's try to keep it. I actually prefer it for lots of reasons because I feel a little better seeing that there are people there listening to what I'm saying. So it just feels a little more human to everybody. But anyway, you do what you like as far as that goes. You don't have to turn your video on either. But if you, one more person coming in. So we'll try it that way and see how it goes. As far as like things like questions, if you have one and it's not like exactly the best moment to ask a question, one option besides just waiting until there is a good moment is you can use the chat. And if you can find that, and then if you type them in there, I think what Heather's going to try to do is keep track of those and let us know that there are questions about stuff. I do want to make sure that you have the chance to only me giving a monologue over here. So, so the topic of these series of I have to do this again. Excuse me. The topic of these series of classes that we're going to do over the next few weeks is about kind of the history and literature of the piano. And what I'd like to do first is just to give a very broad overview, and this is going to just take a couple of minutes of that. And then most of today, what we're going to be talking about are older instruments, instruments that preceded the piano, and just to give us a sense of what they sounded like and how they
The
worked, and
harpsichord. Okay.
to think a little bit about how that influences the way we play music written for those older instruments. So we'll get to that. Let me start by just, gotta find stuff here. All right, can everybody see that I've put a little written something on the screen there? Traditionally, people, when they talk about not only piano music, but about so-called classical music in general, it's usually divided into these four periods. It is a handy way to kind of organize the music. It's a little bit like when people used to talk, I know this is kind of outmoded now, but like the four food groups. You know, there's things that come from these different categories, and as somebody who is involved in teaching students, myself.
Does that bother you? Okay.
Please turn off your microphones.
Yeah, Max, you may actually be able to mute people as the host if you want to try to do that.
Thank you very much. Let me try that. Great. Thank you for telling me that. You're full of useful information here. Okay, that's great. And I think it does allow you to unmute yourself if you need to be unmuted. Anyway, so those four different groups, typically as a teacher, for example, I try to make sure that students are playing things from all those different stylistic periods and not only to play nothing but romantic music or nothing but 20th century music, and to have a kind of a balanced diet, so to speak, of that stuff. In fact, if you apply to a music school, like as a conservatory for college or graduate school, or if you're, a lot of competitions are like this too, they very often say you have to pick a piece from each of these categories. And it's as if to show that you have some sense of the history and the development of music. And of course, these categories are maybe known to you already or maybe not. And they are useful, but they are problematic as well. They're somewhat limiting. the traditional four periods, and we're going to go into a lot more detail over the next few weeks, but today I just want to at least introduce this topic. People usually talk first about the Baroque era. Now, by the way, the Baroque era, and I'll tell you why in a minute, those particular dates, why I picked the date 1685 to 1750. There was, of course, music before that. I think there was probably music for tens of thousands of years before that. But for the purposes of the piano, we almost never play anything that was written earlier than that time period. The keyboard instruments were sort of in their prime by that time, although not the piano in particular by then. But most of the music before that tended to be vocal music. There was a lot more of that, or the music that survived that we know now. Of course, there's lots of music that wasn't even notated. We don't even know what it sounds like anymore. But for the purposes of pianists, usually music kind of started in 1685. Obviously, an exaggeration. Let me ask you all a question. So I wrote down the years 1685 to 1750. Does anybody have a guess about why those dates, and by the way, these are very often the dates that people will choose, why those dates are the ones we think of in connection with the Baroque era? Anyone want to guess? And you can raise your hand or just turn on your microphone or something. Nobody wants to guess?
Because the well-tempered piano was started then by Bach?
Not quite, not yet. But you're sort of in the right, you got part of the right answer there.
Okay.
I'll just tell you so I don't torch you all. That was 1685 was the year that Bach was born, and 1750 was the year Bach died. Bach is such a dominating figure in the Baroque era that although there are other composers that are important from them, it's like that was the Baroque era, was when he was alive. It started before that, honestly, and maybe continued or overlapped with other times, but those were Bach's dates. So those three composers that I have listed there, Bach, Handel, and Scarlatti, are, for pianists' point of view, the most important composers we have in the Baroque era. All three of them, by the way, born in 1685, just by coincidence. There are other important Baroque composers, but I'll just mention those at the top of the list from a keyboard player's point of view. The classical era, the ones who are most important to keep in mind, and we'll go and talk about what all these terms mean in a later class, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. And the reason I wrote maybe Schubert is that Schubert didn't know, as all of these did, that he was born in the classical era and that he died in the Romantic era. He didn't know that. He just lived his life and he wrote music. But later on, people sort of came up with these ideas of what the different styles were. And his style very much straddles these two kinds of things. And so, as I said, we'll talk about it later, but it's a problematic categorization. The Romantic era, you might notice, has a lot of names in it, and that list could really go on quite a bit further than what I have there. The piano, for one thing, really became a very glamorous instrument, and the kind of the instrument that you could show off, and audiences were more interested in people showing off. Again, a topic for a later date. And finally, the 20th and 21st century is a kind of a fourth category that piano music is often divided into. But you might notice that it's a little bit ridiculous because, for example, the Baroque era, which unofficially lasted for something like 65 years, and the 20th and 21st centuries are still going on. Already we've got 120 years of those. It's a little bit of a silly categorization. But those are still helpful ways for us to kind of put people into categories. So over the next few weeks, we'll talk in a lot more detail about what those different descriptive terms mean and how the sort of different composers had similar styles to each other or maybe differences from each other. But for today, I just wanted to give that very, very broad outline. So as I said, the main topic for today is about what was there before the piano. Does anybody happen to know, before I show you the answer, anybody know the answer to either of these two questions? A, when, even approximately, was the piano invented? And does anybody know the name of the person who did it?
Bach.
So it wasn't Bach. Yes, I see somebody has written the answer there in the chat. Yes, so Bartolomeo Cristofori was his name. It's fine that most of you, I assume, are not professional pianists, but even when I have taught this similar class to, conservatory students, they didn't know that guy's name, Cristofori. It seems like a very important person to a pianist. Anyway, Cristofori was invented around 1709. And in fact, I can show you a picture, if I can figure out how to do this. Give me 1 second. This is the one of a very few surviving instruments built by Cristofori. I think this one was from about 1720. And it's in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. You can see it. It's quite easy to go see. They have a musical instrument room there. If you look at it, you may or may not notice a few things that are different from a modern piano. I'll just point them out to save a little time. Among the things that are different are it doesn't have pedals. Pedals were not something that were invented until later. Somebody came up with the idea. What you might not notice, but if you looked carefully, you could figure this out. It doesn't have the same number of keys. It has a smaller number. The range of the piano was smaller. Also, just to note that the piano, it was made like 100% out of wood. And you might think that pianos nowadays are made entirely or mostly out of wood, but that is not the case. There's more metal in a piano, steel in particular, than there is wood. And so the basic point here is that the instrument has evolved quite a lot. I'm hoping we will have time today to hear a little bit of a recording of somebody not playing this specific instrument, but playing another old piano, just to give you an idea also that the sound was somewhat different than what we're used to now. Give me 1 second here. Here we go. Okay, let me actually enlarge this slightly, but I'm hoping people can see it clearly. There we go. Okay, so as I said, the piano was invented around 1709, and he called it, obviously being Italian, he called it in Italian, he said it was a gravicembalo col piano e forte, which translates as a harpsichord with soft and loud. And so those terms piano and forte, which are musical terms, which actually don't really mean those things, but in music they mean soft and loud. They got shortened to pianoforte, and then people thought that was too much to say, so they just say piano. That's where the word piano comes from, the harpsichord that plays soft and loud. We are going to talk about harpsichords in a little bit because that was a very important predecessor of the piano, and Cristofori originally was a harpsichord manufacturer. And so I showed you that photo of the one at the Metropolitan Museum. Some of the earliest composers that we as pianists play and that you expect to hear pianists play in recital nowadays, such as Bach, Handel, and Scarlatti, they didn't have the piano in mind. First of all, you might remember from the previous slide that Bach, Handel, and Scarlatti were all born in 1685, which is to say about 25 years before the piano was invented. And when the piano was invented, I'm sure, first of all, they didn't hear about it right away. This was thankfully in the days before Twitter, and when we got news immediately or had to hear what people had to say immediately. And also, pianos weren't immediately great. They absolutely evolved very gradually over really well over 100 years of making improvements and modifications. There is some evidence, it's not 100% clear, but there's some evidence that Bach, well, he almost certainly heard a piano, an early piano at one point. And the story is that he didn't like it. But I think what really happened is that he didn't think it was so great right away, but he suggested some improvements. Some improvements were made, some ideas that he had about it. And by the end of his life, apparently he had some nice things to say about this newfangled instrument. But he wasn't writing for it. Because it just didn't sound good. He was writing for other instruments. So let me ask you, we've already mentioned one of them. Can anybody think of, besides the harpsichord, that's one that we mentioned and we're going to talk about in a minute, any other instruments that Bach, Handel, and or Scarlatti or any other Baroque composer might have been writing for? Have you heard of them? Any other names?
Organ?
Absolutely. Organ was one of them. Yeah, Bach in particular was famous as a great organist.
Violin?
I'm sorry, can you say one time?
Violin.
Okay, absolutely. Of course, yes, they were writing for other instruments, the violin, the flute, the human voice. That's absolutely true. Of course they were. But in terms of what we now sometimes play on the piano, the music that, although by the way, Bach did transcribe a lot of his own violin music. Some of the violin concertos he transcribed as harpsichord concertos. He was a great recycler, that Bach. I see Heather's hand raised.
I
What was
guess
that?
George also said clavichord.
Yes. Okay. Yes. That is one of the answers I was hoping for. And the clavichord is almost certainly the one that you're like most of you are least familiar with. You get a lot of points for thinking of clavichord. Believe me. So let's talk about those instruments because those influence the way the composers wrote or the style in which the music should be played. Even though nowadays, I don't know how many of you have ever heard a clavichord. If you haven't heard one before, you're going to hear one on video in a few minutes. I don't have one, but I have some videos where I can show you people playing them. So give me one moment here. Okay, so yes, so some of the predecessors of the modern piano include, first of all, the harpsichord, and then I have listed there the clavichord and the organ. The organ is, of course, used today with some frequency. Maybe you don't hear them as often as you hear pianos, but the harpsichord and the clavichord, not as much. So it would be useful for us, I think, to get to know them a little bit in terms of our own understanding of the piano. So the basic description of the harpsichord. This is probably the one that you are the most familiar with. You have the sound of it in your ear more likely than the clavichord. Because you do hear the harpsichord. If you ever listen to classical radio and they play Baroque music, you very often hear a harpsichord maybe as part of the ensemble. The harpsichord basically works by you press on the key, and at the other end of the key is something that plucks the strings. So it's as if you had a string instrument that you're playing 100% of the time pizzicato, or like the guitar. I would bet, I've never looked this up, but I would imagine that the etymology is somehow related harpsichord and harp. It's just something that you pluck the strings. One of the big limitations of the harpsichord is that you cannot influence the kind of sound that you make by pressing harder or softer on the key. So in other words, you can't really play, you can't get louder or softer. It's just, you get the sound that you get. And of course, that's a major limitation, and yet still it was an instrument that was used to a great degree by Baroque composers. So most pianists, I will tell you, when you talk about the harpsichord, they say, oh, harpsichord, yeah, I don't want to listen to the harpsichord. I'd much rather hear that piece by Bach or Scarlatti on the piano. And in a lot of ways, they're right, because there's a lot more you can do with the piano in terms of the range of color and of sound that you can make. The harpsichord is kind of basically the same sound all the time. But the harpsichord has a certain kind of energy, and the kind of the fact that every note is plucked gives it a kind of articulation, if that makes sense. As if every note is played with a consonant, like the letter K or T, and that has a certain kind of sound. So, in fact, what I'd like to do is play for you a recording. It's actually a video that we'll watch a little bit of a pianist who is one of the world's great pianists. His name is Grigory Sokolov, great pianist, and he's going to be playing on the piano a piece by Rameau, someone who lived just a little bit. His life overlapped with Bach's a little bit earlier, a French composer. And I'm sure that you'll think this performance is very fine. He's a great, great pianist. Then afterwards, we're going to hear the same piece played on the harpsichord, and I'm going to end up, by the way, just telling you not only to notice the differences in the sound, but I'm going to ask you a few questions, including the following. Did it sound like Sokolov was trying to imitate the harpsichord? That's one question when he played it on the piano. The second question is just an opinion question. Do you prefer one of these performances to the other? And I'll just ask you why. So let me see how I can share those. This is something I have to remember how to do. Okay. Okay. So first of all, I am eager to hear your thoughts. Of course, first thing is I know that second video was weird. I'm not sure what the point was of like showing his feet and his expression, and you never see his hands. But anyway, I don't know what that was all about, but it was worth hearing the piece. And then the Sokolov video is obviously somebody who sat in the second row of a concert hall and took an illegal cell phone video. But in any case, so first of all, did any of you have the impression that Sokolov, the pianist, was maybe trying to imitate some aspects of the harpsichord sound, and how so? I'm just curious what you would say about that. Well, it seems like the people whose faces I can see seem to agree with the premise. And, he was, among other things, he plays very clearly. He plays very short. That's sort of a little more imitation of the way this harpsichord naturally sounds. The piano can sound different than that. He also, by the way, didn't have a lot of crescendo and diminuendo, getting louder and softer. He did some. But on the harpsichord, you can't do any. You probably didn't miss it in the harpsichord performance, though, because that harpsichord has really found a way to make that piece exciting and interesting. First of all, it's a short piece. It's not, you don't have to have that much range of different color when you're only playing a piece that lasts 2 minutes. Just out of curiosity, there's no wrong or right answer to this. And I don't know how to poll you. How many of you, maybe, I'm just curious, did anybody have a clear answer that they preferred one of the performances? And if so, please tell me.
Maybe you could ask them to raise their hands.
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, so I saw Kelvin raising his hand and talking, but his microphone's off. So let me let Kelvin say what he was going to say, and then we'll see what we'll take a more informal poll. Can you press the mute, or undo the muting?
I have to say, I thought the guy playing the piano failed. It's very, very hard to say, but I thought he was trying to do too much to imitate something else, and he fell in the middle. So I thought the harpsichord player had much more passion for me. It drew me into a sense of resonance, and therefore my hand goes to the harpsichord.
Right. Well, so as a matter of fact, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Uli.
Mine too. I like the harpsichord better.
Yeah. And I saw, I mean, Heather's raising her hand. I think, Heather, you might be pointing out, I saw a brief flash on my chat box window that somebody else said that they preferred, one other person who commented, I couldn't see it. Is that what you're going to say, Heather?
Yes, from George again, George and Freda, preferred harpsichord, too much reverberation on piano.
I see, yeah. So, one of the things, and by the way, maybe everybody can go back to putting their microphones off for the moment, just to make it simple. In fact, maybe I can do that for you. There we go. Yeah, one of the things about that piano performance, which doesn't have to be that way, but I think he was being a little bit more reserved, a little more polite. And I think sometimes, like, we look at this old music and we say, oh, back in the Baroque era, they were all wearing powdered wigs and white gloves, and they were all super polite. I think the truth is that people probably had the same passions and feelings and pluses and minuses and whatever they had back in 1685 as they do now, and so yeah, I personally prefer that harpsichord performance as well. So I also want to play it because most of the time you're going to want to hear the piano more than the harpsichord, I would guess, but that's not automatically the case. But you can hear that pianists definitely, in general, we do try to keep in mind, okay, this music was written for a different instrument. Should I try in some ways to imitate that? Okay, so let me go back to, I'm sorry, Lee. Here we go. Oh, that's the wrong one. Excuse me. We saw that one before. Here we go. Okay, so now the instrument that's almost certainly less familiar to you than the harpsichord is the clavichord. And the basic way that the clavichord works, and I'm going to show you some videos where hopefully you can see it in the video, how some of the mechanism of how the clavichord works, is that it's pretty similar in some ways to the piano. When you have, if you imagine that on the piano you press on a key over here, and then over on this end of a piece of wood, something comes up. In the case of the piano, you press here and the hammer, which is covered with felt, goes flying up and hits the strings. And then it comes back down immediately. It only strikes the strings for a moment. on the clavichord, and there's something in there called, I think it's called an escapement. That's the term. I can't remember all of how the piano is actually made. I should know, but I don't. In the case of the clavichord, what happens is you press on the end of the key, and then the thing that comes into contact with the key, it's called a tangent. Tangent, like meaning it's touching it. It stays in contact with the key. So you'll probably see that in the video. The clavichord, in fact, what I'm going to do is show you a picture of a clavichord here. The clavichord was primarily, in fact, not primarily, entirely, an instrument that you would play at home. Maybe if you had a clavichord that looked as nice as this, you were probably pretty wealthy. But it was, still in your home, not on a concert stage. The clavichord had a very small sound. The harpsichord was the instrument for public performances, and public performances in those days, I mean, being in a place like the 4-H and Ridgeway would have been absolutely pushing it for the size of a room for a concert in the Baroque era, and certainly not in a big concert hall of like 3,000. But a harpsichord would play in the small spaces that in those days were used for public performance. But the clavichord was something you would play at home. And as a reminder, if you wanted to hear music back in 1700, you didn't have anything like the options we have today. Somebody had to be in your house playing it live, or singing, or whatever it was they were doing. And it was definitely a part of people's education, particularly young women. That was like a sophisticated young woman might take lessons on an instrument in order to be able to provide entertainment in the home. That was the only way for it to happen. So the clavichord, you can see also, it has a lot fewer keys than the modern piano does. And you might be able to see, even from this photo, the kind of the mechanism where if you press on the keys, those pieces of wood jump up and strike the keys. So as I said, the clavichord had a very small sound, but because your finger stays in contact, you could say, with the string indirectly through this. You can influence, unlike on the harpsichord. You can press harder and it is louder. You can press softer and the sound is softer, just like on the piano. Not to the same degree. It doesn't have the same range of dynamic. It's basically soft and softer on the clavichord, but you can influence it. The other thing that you can do on the harpsichord, and I'm going to show a video, not the first video I show you, but the second one, is going to include this. You can do something on the clavichord, which I wish I could do on the piano. As I said, on the piano, when you press on the key, the hammer comes right back down, and that's the last that you can influence the sound. You can't do anything about it except decide when the sound stops. That's the only thing you can do. You can't make it louder, you can't make it softer. On the clavichord, this end of what you press on stays in contact with the key. So if you start going like this, it creates an effect like vibrato. The vibrato that a singer can do, that a violinist can do, but that a pianist can't do. And I'll show you a little video of that. The first performance here, he doesn't do any of that, but I'll show you a video where someone does, just so you can hear it. So it's kind of a cool feature that, as I said, I wish I could do on the piano. Okay, let me share a video of somebody playing on a clavichord, so you can hear the sound of that. Okay, so I hope you all saw that little demonstration in the second video of somebody doing vibrato on a keyboard instrument. Not possible on the piano, but yes, possible on the clavichord. One of the things I really want to emphasize here, well, first of all, the clavichord, as you can see, has a very small sound. Not really appropriate for something out except for like, your family gathering around and hearing the music in the same room. It wasn't really appropriate for a concert instrument. But there are definitely stories of Bach saying that how much he preferred, in some ways, the clavichord to the harpsichord. Bach was, of course, a great harpsichord player. He was a great organist. I'm sure he was great at playing the clavichord. He could do all those things fine. But one of the things that you can do at the clavichord, as I said before, you can play a little louder. You can play softer. You can do whatever it is. You can make a shape in the same way that a singer makes a phrase, or a violinist or a flutist. It's just the harpsichord in particular that had that limitation. And part of the reason I mention this is that there are many pianists who grow up with this kind of idea that they should play the piano like a harpsichord, and so they play everything very, very flat. So everything is a little bit like a machine, and not realizing that you can absolutely make louder and softer. You can have little shape there in that sort of way on the clavichord, just as you can on the piano, not to the same degree. However, I'm sure you notice that the sound of the clavichord also is also very dry, right? Not that different in a certain way. The tone quality from a harpsichord is kind of similar, the kind of ping, 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 ping kind of sound. So again, that's one option among many for a composer in the Baroque era writing for a keyboard instrument, but although the piano was not. I think there was a question, but I didn't quite see it. Let me see if I can look in the...
Yes, I can read it to you. How does the size of keys on a clavichord compare with those on a piano?
You know what? I believe that they're generally smaller. I haven't seen in my lifetime more than a half a dozen clavichords. I will say that I think the size of the keys was somewhat variable. The piano is absolutely standardized at this point. But those older instruments, some people made them different ways. Bigger, smaller. You have a big house, you have a small house. You have, and they would have different numbers of keys, like the tunes. So I think there's some variety of that. So yeah, I think they were a little bit smaller. However, as I've noticed, I've goofed around on a clavichord. I don't have one, or else I'd play it for you in my house. But yeah, I think they were a little smaller. And certainly the instrument itself was very small. You can see you could just move it from one room to another if you wanted to, which is not feasible, certainly with a piano, and not even with a harpsichord. It's just too big. You have to have your whole crew come over and help you move it. But a clavichord, put it under your arm, move it to another space. So it was, as I said, the home instrument, and the harpsichord was the concert instrument, basically. Let me go back to the sheet we were looking at before. Here we are. So another important instrument, of course, that preceded the piano and continued to be used and continues to be used today is the organ. The organ, of course, has lots of great features to it. And by and large, the music that pianists might steal, harpsichord music, clavichord music, and play it on our modern piano, I don't think this is not meant as a trick question. Why can we not usually do that so easily with organ music? What is it about the organ that makes it, well, that's one, so I see a comment there, the note duration. That is a thing. It is, so the organ you can sustain indefinitely. You can put your finger down and you keep it there. It will stop when you lift your finger. Whereas on the piano, it is true that if you play a note on the piano, I'm going to play one now on my piano, and probably by the time I get to the end of this sentence, you will barely be able to hear this note if you can hear it at all. I guess you can kind of still hear it. It's almost gone, but it's very soft. So, but on the organ, it will last indefinitely. That's true. There's another reason, though. Thank you very much, Kelvin. That is the thing. On the organ, you have your right hand playing something, you have your left hand playing something else, and then you have your feet playing the pedals, which in the organ's case, those are used Actually, they have more than one function, but mostly your feet are going to be playing pitches. They have a kind of a keyboard down there. So occasionally there are arrangements. For example, the composer Busoni, who lived near the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, would transcribe pieces to be able to play them on the piano. But it takes some arranging, and some organ music just simply cannot be arranged for the piano. There's too many things going on all at once. Yes, and then there was a comment I saw in the chat about the multiple keyboards. The harpsichord also might have that, by the way. You still only have two hands, and what they typically happens on those instruments that have more than one keyboard is that you can set them to have different kind of tone quality. So on the organ, you can go and say, okay, let's choose these stops that have this sound quality for this keyboard, and this sort of stop that has that kind of sound quality. So for a different kind of sound. So that's there as well. But you can do that on the piano to some degree. You can make different sounds with different hands. But the fact that there are pedals. So mostly when pianists play Baroque music, we're playing music that was intended for the harpsichord and or for the clavichord. In fact, a lot of music, we'll talk about this next week when we talk about Bach in particular, that's the plan. He wrote a lot of music which he said was for the Klavier. In modern German, Klavier, spelled with a K, means piano, specifically piano. But in an older Bach's time, Klavier, spelled with a C, meant keyboard instrument, any keyboard instrument. And so he's like, you can play it on a harpsichord, you can play it on a clavichord, whatever you have, that's fine. But generally speaking, we're not playing organ music because it's too hard. Now, what I would like to just take a very, very brief moment to show you, because I don't want to run out of time for a few other things. I want to show you an example not only of piano instruments that preceded the piano, but a little bit of a performance on an early piano. As I said, pianos not only were preceded by these instruments that were quite different, but they also developed over time, and basically improvements were made, but also just changes were made, whether they were improvements or not. And so you remember from seeing that photo that I had of the Cristofori piano that was in the Metropolitan Museum, that it had fewer keys, for example. That one didn't have pedals. I'm going to play for you a little bit of a video, and I would love to play all of it. We just don't quite have the time for it. Of a pianist who specializes in playing these older instruments. His name is very hard for me to pronounce. I've met him, nice guy, but I can't pronounce his name. Last name is Bezuidenhout. Anyway, you'll see, it's a Dutch name. So in any case, you will hear that the sound of this instrument is quite different from the modern piano. He also, in this video, which we don't have time to watch all of, maybe I'll send the link to you all later, that he talks about the differences in the piano. But for now, we're just going to get a little bit of the sound of it in our ear. Okay, so as I said, we can't go into a whole lot of detail about what the differences are. He does in that video, and as I said, I'll try to send you guys the link in case you want to watch it. It's about a 5-minute video. But one thing you might notice, oh, I should explain one thing. That piano is a replica of something from about Mozart's time. That's why I played some Mozart on it to demonstrate it. It's not an actual piano from Mozart's time because you might have noticed it was in very good shape. It was very shiny, for one thing, that piano, but it was a replica made in the same way that they made those pianos before. What you might notice at the very least is that the sound of it, again, is somewhat dry compared to what we tend to expect from the sound of a piano. I don't know to what degree composers thought that was good or bad. That's just the way that the instruments sounded. It's as if it sounds somewhat more similar to, again, to a harpsichord. Even though this was a new instrument with a new technology, it still sounded a bit like a harpsichord, which also sounds a bit like a clavichord. So generally speaking, when pianists play music from that era, we are aware, at least, of that somewhat different sound quality, and we tend not to, we hope, sort of smother the music with a lot of pedal. It's a little bit like pouring a lot of sauce over your pasta or something. Well, that's not necessarily bad, but it's a little bit, it's just a different thing you're aiming for. So I think it's good to have some awareness of that, although also the piano can be played in a variety of ways. We have the option to try to imitate the sound of those instruments. I have a philosophical question that I don't have the answer to. I just think it's worth thinking about, is that if we are playing the piano, so for example, something I do, and we're playing music from an older time period, meaning not in the 20th or 21st century when pianos have been kind of more or less standardized, should we be trying to imitate the sound of those older instruments? And the answer to that is I don't really know, because we sort of do and we sort of don't. We want to keep in mind what some of the sounds were that they had. At the same time, we think, well, wouldn't it be nice to be able to make a little crescendo? Or wouldn't it be nice to use a little bit of pedal? It's probably similar if you talk about having a Shakespeare play and you do Hamlet. You can go very far, and you can have Hamlet be dressed in a leather jacket and and do whatever, or you can sort of try to imitate Shakespeare's conventions. But by the way, the theater you're going to see it in is probably not quite like the Globe Theater, and there's running water in the bathrooms and things like that. So we make certain accommodations in the modern era, but we also imitate to some degree. So anyway, I don't have the answer to that question. It's a philosophical question that I can't answer, but it's worth thinking about. So what I'd like to do with that in mind is I'm going to play one piece for you. It's a very short piece by Scarlatti. Scarlatti was definitely writing the piece I'm going to play. It's a sonata in C major. He definitely had the harpsichord in mind as an instrument. You can tell me whether you thought I was trying to imitate the harpsichord or not. But let me, for one thing, I'm going to try to adjust my... Oh, I don't want my iPad to fall down. Okay, you can kind of see what I'm doing over here. Okay. Okay. That's a thank you. So I hope that you noticed that to some degree I was trying to imitate the fact that the harpsichord has a very clear sound. I also did not play, however, like everything exactly the same. I played a little louder here, a little softer there. So I took advantage of some things that the piano can do that the harpsichord cannot. I tried to take some of what is the natural sound of the harpsichord and to do that. That's, I would say most pianists do that. However, as I said in the example of Shakespeare plays where people are wearing leather jackets in the play, there's also sometimes there's the approach to say we're just going to play it in a totally different way, and why not? Because this piece has been around for 300 years, why not play it a different way? So, but I would say that that's definitely, as I said, the philosophical question for us. Should we try to imitate the sound of those instruments? So I hope that you got to hear some things that you didn't already know about before. I'd love for, and everybody should feel welcome to turn on their video slash audio. And if you have questions and stuff you want to talk about, this is a great time to do it. Anything we talked about today, or anything we didn't talk about today, and you wonder why we didn't talk about it.
I'll start, Max. And I don't want you to sort of get away from your syllabus, but one of my favorite keyboard instruments is called the harmonium. Harmonium. And I think it's basically more an Eastern instrument than a Western instrument. I may be wrong there, but does that figure, I don't know how old it is, does that figure in the pantheon of keyboard instruments classically?
So I don't know anything about it. Isn't it sort of similar to an organ? Am I right about that?
It's actually a little keyboard. It's just about this size. You can pick it up like a suitcase.
I have to admit, I really don't know.
I
I will tell you that definitely, like, Bach wasn't writing for it. Let's put it that way, but that's as much as I can tell you about it. Sorry, I think somebody else was saying something that I interrupted.
I think the Indians still do it, with some of the kirtan music where they have this harmoniums and you even squeeze it to have the air going through it. That's all I know.
Maybe similar to like the accordion in some ways, like it's portable and you make the sound by, I have to admit I don't know much about it. Sorry. Other comments or questions or?
Max, there's always the question, had Mozart been alive today, how would he have written his music? Probably very different from what he originally wrote, but, that's part of your philosophical question, I think.
Yeah, it is a big question. I mean, Mozart in particular, I'm thinking of because you're probably mentioning because he died at such a young age, and it's hard to know like what developments would have happened later, and what developments might have been influenced by the instruments. This is what sort of was the topic today, that were there. I really don't know the answer when we think about like, wouldn't Bach have wished that he could write for the piano? Wouldn't Mozart have wished that the instruments he had sounded like a modern Steinway D piano? I don't know if he did. And there are some advantages, and actually I didn't really talk about this very much, but there are definitely advantages to those older instruments. In general, we think of them as being less, there's a reason why you hear pianos in concerts and not clavichords. But for example, the clarity of the sound, you all heard that in that harpsichord performance, many of you seem to clearly prefer the harpsichord version, and it has something to do with the approach of the performer to the piece, but also just the natural quality of the instrument that has that sort of immediacy. That clarity, one time I met a friend of mine in a supermarket. We had this conversation. He'd been in school at the time, and he was studying. He was a pianist, but he developed a real interest in these older instruments, including early pianos. And he was telling me that one of the things on them is that the bass sound, this is hard for me to explain exactly why, but the bass register of early pianos, for example, from Beethoven's time, even if you go back even that, like slightly more recent than Mozart, was a lot clearer. You could also say it was a lot thinner. It didn't have the same resonance and support that you get from a modern piano. But he said, the result is that when you play something loud in the bass area of a modern piano, sometimes it sounds a little like, the sound rings. You can't play short. You can't play ba, 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 and go wah, wah, wah. So he was saying there was a Beethoven piece he was talking about specifically that where it's supposed to be very loud in the bass register, and he says on those old pianos it sounds like you're playing like timpani, butter bum 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 bum, which is a thing you can't quite do on the modern piano. Some other advantages like the vibrato thing, so maybe those composers. It's hard for me to know if they would have wished Mozart, for example, would have wished for different circumstances, or whether they were happy with what they had. I don't know. But it is interesting sometimes to hear that the music on different instruments. It brings out different qualities in the music.
I have one more question. As an eminent concert pianist, played all over the world, played on many pianos, would you consider the Bosendorfer to be the #1 instrument in the world, or what would be your view?
Not my favorite. I mean, and it's not just because I'm supposed to say this, but I prefer Steinway as an instrument, the Steinway D piano. But Bösendorfer can be great. I don't love them personally, but lots of other people do. You don't see them nearly as often. They are certainly the most expensive piano. But for me, the Bösendorfer has a really beautiful sound. This is just, and by the way, I should say this is my opinion. Doesn't mean it's an official thing that everybody should go by. I think Bösendorfer is a really beautiful sound, but I feel like it has like kind of one or two sounds. That one or two beautiful sounds. The Steinway has more of a range of like different quality of sound you can make on the instrument. The truth is, however, that every piano is different, and it depends, among other things, a lot on the maintenance of the piano. But even when they make them, they're not all the same. They come out better or worse for whatever reason. There are good years, bad years. They're human beings making the instruments. They come out a little bit differently. So not every Steinway is the greatest instrument ever. Some are great and some are not. And certainly there's a big difference between like a concert instrument, like a 9-foot instrument that's made for that. They put a lot more care into that than they do into an instrument that's going to go into someone's home. The most reliable piano, I can tell you, if you're trying to get one that you're like really feel like you're sure it's going to sound very, very good, because by the way, Steinway's sometimes falling apart. The most reliable is a Yamaha. So if you, and I remember you specifically, Kelvin, arranged for getting a Yamaha that we have now in the 4H, right? So that's always a good choice, because Yamahas are always in good shape, and when you see one, you feel like it's going to sound fine. You see a Steinway, you're not sure. It depends on whether it was taken care of or not taken care of. So anyway, Bösendorfer is a great piano. I'm not criticizing it, but I would prefer to play a Steinway. I'm also a Steinway artist, so I'm supposed to say that, but I'm not saying it for that reason. I really do prefer them. So,
Max, what effect does the wood, shellac, whatever, have on the sound of the piano? Is it analogous to that in a violin?
I wish I could tell you this with absolute certainty, because I actually don't know. I imagine that I'm sure that the choice of wood is important. I can't remember what kind they use, but for example, all those piano manufacturers are very specific about what kind of wood they use in the piano. In terms of the varnish, I don't know what difference it makes on the piano, except the weird thing is that in my experience, if you play a piano that isn't black, it never sounds good. And I don't know why. It's like I don't think there's a reason. It seems like you should be able to make a white piano but I mean, this is a kind of a running joke among pianists. We're like, oh, you never trust, like, you see a piano is brown, it's not going to sound good. Now, the thing is, it's not necessarily true. Yeah, sorry about that. If you have a brown piano at home. So,
Yeah.
but it's one of those things. So I don't know how it affects it. The person to ask this to is probably more like someone like Susan Lund, or someone who like actually like deals with pianos. Let me tell you that pianists, among all instrumentalists, we're the ones who are the most clueless about our actual instrument, about how it works. A violinist doesn't need someone else to tune their violin, and so that's like, but I don't know how to tune a piano. I mean, I have a vague idea, but I'm like, if I start doing it, it's going to get worse and worse. It's better for me to just leave it and then get the piano tuner to come over and do it. But about the mechanics inside the piano, I'm not 100% sure. I'm sure that those two things do have an influence, but I don't know what influence they have. That's a really good question.
You were talking about tuning, Max. Could you comment a little bit on how these instruments were tuned? I mean, what was special about Bach's well-tempered clavichord, or well-tempered clavier?
So, first of all, so basically the well-tempered is a tuning system. that's some, and Bach didn't invent it, but somebody else came up with the idea, and Bach was in support of that. This is also something better answered by a piano tuner than by me. But what I will say is that the very basic thing is that prior to that time, and by the way, it's been sort of superseded by some other tuning system, which I don't remember what it's called, but it's slightly modified from that. But the early tuning system, if you play a string instrument, you would know that you tend to play things like the seventh degree of the scale. So if you're playing a scale, that note that I keep emphasizing, you tend to play a little higher. It's actually the term for that is the leading tone in a scale, and it tends to be a little closer. And the other notes are a little closer together or further apart. It's actually based on physics, like the harmonic series. On the piano, what somebody came up with this idea that Bach agreed with is that it kind of made a compromise. And I don't know how to explain this. If you tune a harpsichord in the old days, they would tune it for a certain key, like, we're going to play a piece in C major. So the harpsichord would sound in tune for C major. If you went to some other keys, like G major, it would still sound fine. If you went to F sharp major, it would sound terrible. It would be like really out of tune for that key. It's hard to explain why. It just has to do with that notes string players play slightly higher or lower because they can make those tiny adjustments anytime. But the piano, nowadays we can. And certainly a keyboard instrument can't. You can't adjust it except by going in and tuning the instrument. So you couldn't go from C major to F sharp major without it sounding horribly out of tune. Sorry, it's hard for me to explain exactly why, but the well-tempered system was a kind of a compromise where everything is slightly out of tune, but everything sounds basically fine, and we're all used to it. String players, when they play with the piano, they know that they adjust. They play a little differently. Like, I can't play exactly the same way as if I'm playing in a string quartet. The half steps are a little bit larger. The whole steps are a little bit smaller. That's a very, very vague description of it. So, yes, the tuning system changed. The thing about that well-tempered clavier is that that tuning system that Bach was in support of. Again, he didn't invent it, but he thought it was a good idea to do that. It meant you didn't have to retune your harpsichord or whatever instrument you were playing for every single piece. You could just tune it, and that was it. And you could play a piece in C major, and then you could play a piece in C sharp major, which sound like they're very close together, but on those older tuning systems, they would sound terrible. So Bach wrote a piece in every single major and minor key to show, hey, it sounds good when you just leave it in the same tuning system. Although that may sound like so what? So I could only play pieces in C major and G major, so I played, on a different day, I played C sharp and A flat major. That ended up, and I'm not sure if this is going to make sense, but it opened up the possibilities of one piece of music starting out in C major, going to F sharp major, coming back to C major. That was possible after the tuning system changed. Of course, it was possible before, too, for everybody except keyboard players. You could do it on the violin, you could do it, an orchestra could do it. But a lot of composers, they kind of think, and they work things out at the keyboard, they kind of play. And so I think their imagination was somewhat, sometimes, not limited, but they wouldn't think about modulating from C major to F sharp major because that would sound terrible when they were practicing it. And then when it didn't sound terrible because the tuning system changed, I thought, hey, why not? I could do this. So I know that's a little bit, I'm getting a little technical there, but that's one of the things about the tuning system ended up. So basically the general thing that I would say is that all pianos nowadays are a little bit out of tune, but it's a kind of a compromise, so everything sounds kind of in tune. But I will also say, remember, I'm a pianist. I'm not a piano tuner. I know much less than I should about the piano, and any violinists or clarinetists would know a lot more about their instrument than I do about mine. Any other questions for now? So I think on the kind of, thank you very much, Heather, for making that kind of, I don't know if you call it a poster or a kind of a brochure, but whatever it is that lists all of the things we're going to do. So every week we have a little bit of a different theme, and I think next week the main focus is going to be about Bach, a little bit more generally about the Baroque style. As I mentioned before, Bach is the really towering figure of that style. So we're primarily going to talk about Bach. That's our plan for next week, so I hope you're ready for that. If there aren't any other comments, I guess I'll say goodbye. It's great to see you all. I hope to see you all next week too. and tell your friends if you think they would enjoy learning a little bit about piano music, but they won't learn what they were supposed to today. Although I think, by the way, I think the plan is for me to send, this is being recorded, I'll send it to Heather, and she'll have it in case somebody wants to watch it later. So, okay. All right. Well, it's great to see you all. Take care. Stay safe. Wear masks.
you.
Wash your hands.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.